see, January 16th, 2024, Planning Commission meeting. Do a little roll call. Mark Klecker, present. Rich?
Present.
Here. Jason?
Here.
Tony? Anybody on? Or Colin?
No.
Okay.
Tony will not be.
Okay. Election of officers. I'm assuming you and I are going to do the same thing?
Yes.
You have, unless you want one of these positions. There you go.
I'll make the motion to continue with our two officers from previous year.
Okay.
Mark as the chair and Mr. Spiker as our vice chair.
I'll second that.
Okay.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Do you guys look at the minutes
Yes.
from last meeting? Is there any corrections or,
Nope. I'll make a motion to approve as distributed.
and a second?
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Zoning ordinance amendments.
I'm sorry, I missed the motions on the minutes.
Yeah.
First and second? Thank you.
Unless you want to be the second.
Doesn't matter.
Okay, for the zoning ordinance amendments, we wanted to continue the discussion that we've been having. There were amendments recommended that addressed some of the ambiguity in the screening language in the ordinance, and also that was kind of a big deal for the zoning hearing board. Members are here today. They're responsible for looking at special exception requests for short-term rentals in the city in the R1 and R1A districts. There was some concern about the language, about interpreting the language for screening, off-street parking requirements, and also for occupancy. So that's why we're here today, to continue that discussion about proposed amendments to tighten up the language in the ordinance, to make that interpretation easier and hopefully less subject to potential challenges as far as zoning compliance is concerned. Again, we kind of handled the screening language was something that the Planning Commission already endorsed. The specifying the number of our off-street parking spaces was something that the Planning Commission has endorsed. This has all been in consultation with the Solicitor's Office. And so the issue of occupancy is, we're looking at the language in the ordinance. As it currently is stated in the ordinance, under 30557.3, it says, STR accommodations shall not exceed the number of occupants allowed within the applicable zoning district. That's a blanket statement that talks about occupancy. And you could look at that it's implied, the occupancy, maximum occupancy in R1 and R1A districts as far as residential occupancy is single-family dwellings. You could look at that current language and say, well, it seems like that's kind of implied, that maximum occupancy would be limited to a single-family dwelling. It's not explicitly stated that way, however. Also in 30557, we do have language regarding additional regulations for R1 and R1A. And the occupancy, there's not a special statement for occupancy in R1 and R1A. It would fall back to that language in sentence number 3. So that's really where we're at this point, and I know that we had members of the zoning hearing board that wanted to kind of be able to speak to those concerns directly to the Planning Commission. So they're here today, and I think at this point, we could just open the floor to discussion.
Sounds good. Sure.
Good afternoon. I'm Laura Gunchin. I am the outgoing chair of the Zoning Hearing Board. Tom Siebold, who is on the board, and Jeff Johnson, who is the incoming chair. So as Jake mentioned, we've had several requests relative to special exception. The issue that we have with the language relative to screen planting and parking is that if we apply the ordinance as it's written, it almost exclusively eliminates most of the applicants relative to screen planting and relative to parking, specifically off-street parking. So we've had a number of conversations at the board level about a potential fix for that. We've reviewed the draft that the Planning Commission has drafted as well, and Tom specifically has some comments for today. We have, I think, Jake, you can correct me if I'm wrong, at least 3, if not 4 requests that are tabled right now that have been tabled since October, some of them since October, because we want to provide a clear path forward for people that are applying, that are doing the right thing, right? We know that there are short-term rentals out there that are not going through the process, and we don't feel that it's appropriate for us to be punitive to the individuals that are formally coming through the process and want to do the right thing. So again, appreciate the opportunity to be with you today and talk about those issues.
All right.
You want to come up?
So what's your recommendation, though, of eliminating the parking requirement?
Modifying the parking requirement. Screen planting, I was surprised actually to see screen planting then further amended in what I'm calling the parent ordinance, right? I was kind of surprised to see that it was then amended at that level, whereas if you looked at the requirements for sororities and fraternities, it requires that screen planting around the back side of it. Our issue was the way the short-term rental ordinance was written, screen planting was around the entire perimeter, which is also almost impossible. You have houses that have driveways that abut driveways, that's almost impossible, right?
Yeah, so how can, if it's on a cul-de-sac and it's impossible to provide a parking space. So how do we-
Exactly. So we thought the intent of the screen planting was to provide that privacy in areas where folks would predominantly be in the backyard or would be in the side yard. To make that more reasonable, the sorority and fraternity language in the zoning ordinance we feel would be applicable. Where I have concerns with the amendments to the broader ordinance relative to screen planting is I think it's really important, for example, commercial and industrial that butts up against a residential neighborhood or adult use uses within the ordinance also has a screen planting requirement. If you think about Juliet's on 8th Street, there's a screen planting requirement there that if that were to go away, per the suggestion, then it's a privacy fence. To me, there's a big difference between a privacy fence and screen planting in a situation like that, where there, I feel, is an easier fix by utilizing the sorority and fraternity language relative to screen planting.
Can we craft the language in the ordinance in a way that provides the zoning hearing board flexibility and interpretation on how to apply, when and how to apply? Like 1 parking space per unit when the geography allows, right? If there's a
So that's difficult, and I can appreciate that suggestion. That's difficult then, because then we're open to interpretation.
Yeah.
And as a quasi-judicial board, then we're opening ourselves in the city up to that
we need
appeal
to be
at the
more
court
black and
level.
white on it.
Yeah. So the parking requirement with being off-street, and my understanding from city council was that with requiring off-street parking, it was the intent of not dumping all of this parking out into the city system, right, for short-term rentals. If you're coming and you're one family, but you're coming from 4 different locations and you have 4 cars, requiring all those cars to be off-street. But the way that it's written then is you can't have any impediment to egress, right? So if you have a long driveway and a garage, it's a single driveway, that's 1 off-street parking space. Because in order to get that car out, you'd have to move the other one. Right, so that kind of sets it up for failure, whereas the board has talked about a lot that houses in the city of Erie do not have a 2-wide, many of them do not have a 2-wide driveway, right? So as it's written then, and as it's amended, we're dumping those cars out onto the city system, out onto the street, whereas in somewhere like East 38th, in Glenwood, you're going to have a lot of folks that are going to have a complaint with that, and then code enforcement is able to revoke a permit, right?
It's a requirement in the STR ordinance that all guest parking is off-street. Has to be. They have to post a notice, they have to say how many cars can park there, and that all guest minimum of one, then you're effectively, you're setting these people up for failure.
Absolutely.
Because if I'm a neighbor, I'm just gonna call in every time there's 3 cars parked on the street. So you either have to remove that, which I'm not exactly for, or amend it so that you allow, you know, end-to-end parking in the driveway would be fair, I think, in that. But it's still gonna limit occupancy in my mind. So again, if you go to the sorority fraternity parking reg, it's 1 per 4 occupants. Average family in Pennsylvania, average household is 2.4, I think, which is a weird number. So maybe round that up to 3 and say 1 per 3 off-street parking. I think it has to be somewhat strict because, as Laura said, you can't, especially, this is for all neighborhoods, by the way, not just R1. So I think if in the more dense districts, if you're jamming all those cars down there, these are a nuisance at that point. So it's definitely something that's not going to be resolved by saying 1 per unit or 1 per whatever.
I also think it's
There's
not,
a national movement right now to eliminate parking minimums in zoning. Like 50 cities in the United States have already done this.
In residential areas.
Everywhere, all parking minimums.
Yeah.
yeah.
And I think this, like, we've already actually talked about this 2 months ago. And that's on my list of 2024 goals, is
Right up to
Tackle that.
and stuff like that. I'm aware of it in downtown urban areas and things like that, where there's parking garages and giant lots and things like that taking up space, but,
more non-taxable
in
lands.
residential neighborhoods, and then you add people who specifically come by car, because ain't nobody coming in by helicopter.
Yeah, there's people who whine about it in every city that does it, but ultimately move the city forward because it's a progressive concept.
We also have the odd even
Buffalo
parking,
just did it.
which is a problem in the winter, right? So,
Yeah,
so,
we get-
there's a lot, I get trying to limit parking, but you can't get rid of it, and you
Yeah,
can't.
so you
make it
say,
too
but
small.
yeah, there's studies that have been done that this is why this is a national trend right now that's occurring. That
Yeah,
it's
but
happening.
nobody's getting rid of parking.
Well, I wouldn't mind getting rid of cars altogether, but